Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the last session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. I am Ishaan Sharma, founder of Karwan, and I am so delighted and honored to have joined by four great scholars, Dr. Supriya Gandhi, Dr. Purnima Dhawan, Dr. Divya Cherian, and Dr. Abhishek Kaicker. Karwan Online History Festival was a 4-month long journey of digital interactions and an attempt at bringing history on your screens with specially curated lectures and panel discussions through our Facebook page. Today, we are going to discuss about the 18th century in South Asia. And our panelists are Dr. Supriya Gandhi, who is a historian of Mughal India, and she teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University. She grew up in India, received her PhD from Harvard, and also studied in Iran and Syria. She is the author of The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shukoh, in Mughal India. She is also the great-granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. Dr. Divya Cherian is a historian of early modern South Asia with an interest in social, cultural, and religious history, ethics, and law, in the local and the everyday. Her research focuses on Western India, chiefly on the region that is today Rajasthan. She is an assistant professor at the Department of History, Princeton University. She is the author of The Power of Virtues, Hindus and Untouchables in 18th Century India. Abhishek Kaicker is assistant professor of history at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on South Asia in the early modern and modern periods. His recent work has focused on the development of cultures of politics in the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, particularly in the capital city of Delhi. He is the author of The King and the People: Sovereignty and Popular Politics in Mughal Delhi. Doctor Purnima Dhawan's research interests encompass the social and cultural history of early modern South Asia, 1500 to 1800, the ways in which religious, linguistic, and status identities shaped the political and cultural institutions of the Mughal period is central to her work. She is an associate professor at the University of Washington. So without further ado, I would request the speakers to start with the presentations. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in for this special session, which is very close to my heart because it is the final session of our long journey. Starting with Professor Kecker.
I thought perhaps maybe it would make sense if Professor Dhawan were to begin, and then I could do the second presentation. Is that what we had sort of decided?
Sure, sir. So Professor Dhawan can start with the presentation.
All right, I'm loading up my PowerPoint. So let me begin by thanking Ishaan Sharma and Karwan for organizing this, and to Professor Gandhi for putting all of us in touch with each other. Let's take a look at this title. Some of the wording is very intentional. When I talk about the commemoration and remembering of vernacular intellectuals, I take the word intellectual seriously because I do not want to see the people that we are talking about only in the capacity of being spiritual leaders in their community as bhagats and peer, which is often what happens. I think their ideas are important to think about because it is the power of those ideas that mobilize the communities I'm going to talk about in this talk today. And the other word is the remembering, which is also intentional, if slightly macabre. But what I mean by that is when we look at what has been passed down to us in terms of either material sources or written sources about their lives, it's harder to get at the whole picture. What we are getting is bits and pieces that have filtered down through the commemorative practices of their communities. So let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. When I first started researching material for my first book, I found that there was a complete diversity of small shrines, community get-together places like chaubaras, makbaras, khanakas, gurudwaras, thakurdwaras that were scattered all over the rural landscape. And I realized after talking with many other scholars, this was not the case just in Punjab, but in other provinces in the Mughal world also. And it bothered me that there was such little material available on these very minor and often forgotten communities. So for my second and third project, I'm working on some of these, but from different aspects of it. Now, why do I think this is important? Well, part of this has to do with the fact that to a certain extent, many of these communities and the places where they met were not funded by elite patronage. To a large extent, they depended on local networks for the day-to-day well-being. And although some were fortunate enough to attract elite patronage later in their historical life, the early beginnings were always rooted in the communities from which they emerged. So let me give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So the picture you see before you on the left is the tomb of Sheikh Musa Ahangar, a blacksmith in Mughal Lahore. And the tomb itself is very interesting, although it is a modest shrine. It had a lot of decoration on it, which you can no longer see. If you look at the top of the gumbad, what you do see is a lot of very beautiful tile work in this bluish green turquoise color. And if you go inside, some of the original decorations do remain, although extensive parts of the shrine have been redone during the 19th century as more and more members of the community around this tomb became interested in preserving this legacy. We do know that Musa Ahangar had a large following. In the works of Abul Fazl, he mentions that the saint had passed away in the early years of Akbar's reign. We don't have a precise date for that. But we also know that he, even within his lifetime, he was credited with a lot of miracles and was extremely popular amongst the artisanal communities in Lahore. So small glimpses like this are very intriguing to social historians, in part because they help us see elements and individuals and communities that don't often rise to it. Now, others are much more well known. Almost everybody who does anything with Punjab studies, of course, knows about the Sufi poets in Punjab, and in particular, Madhur Shah Hussain. Here is a contemporary picture of the celebration of the Urs ceremony. And Shah Hussain is, of course, one of the earliest of the so-called Sufi poets in Punjab. He himself comes from modest beginnings. But we know a lot about his work, in part because his life was very much commented on and written about. And more recently, there's been a lot of scholarly activity around him. So let me give you a sense of how people like Madhur Shah Hussain become famous, right? We know a lot about this circle, in part because Shah Hussain was not simply just a singular scholar in this kind of isolated community. He was extremely well networked. We have Mughal sources that do mention his shrine in both close to his death, but also in later years. We also have sources that are both primary and secondary. So in terms of primary sources, we can look at Shah Hussein's compositions themselves. They were written primarily in Punjabi. And what's interesting is he takes the voice of the Virahani. So he's very much using vernacular tropes that we are familiar with in Bhakti and Sufi studies. But we have a large number of Persian sources about this particular community as well. And these are helpful, even though they're written a little bit later, because they help us see the networks that emerged, that supported the shrine and were invested in it. Now, some are very removed from Madhur Shah Hussein's community. For example, this goes to Supriya Gandhi's work, Dara Shukoh, who took a keen interest in documenting the lives of Sufis. So he is mentioned in the Safinat al-Afrin, for instance. But we also have Persian sources written by community members themselves. So the next two are sources of people who were in the second generation of this community. That means their fathers were involved and were directly familiar with figures like Shah Hussain and Shah Hasuteli, who were like primary members of this original generation. We have a Masnavi by Sheikh Mahmud, for example, that is directly about the relationship between Shah Hussain and his companion and lover, the Hindu Brahmin Madho. And then we have another Taskra that survives in only a single copy, written by an individual called Surat Singh, who himself was a Kango who was involved in rent collection in Mughal administration. And he writes the Tazkira-e-Pir Hasuteli in the mid-17th century. Now, one of the reasons that these Persian sources are important to us is they tell us a lot about this particular group. And I want to draw your attention to Shah Hasuteli, because he pops up in the colonial sources as well. We know by the 19th century, there was a tomb dedicated to Shah Hasuteli in Lahore. It's no longer extant. But his shop, where he had sold grains and briefly also sold oil, so the last name Teli, right, had been preserved by members in his community. The oilmen of Lahore thought of him as their own personal saint. And Sayyid Latif, in his 19th century history of Lahore, talks about this eternal lamp that was lit in that store and kept burning at all times. But if you look at the people who are gathered around this community, they are very, very eclectic. They are described in the sources as malamatiyas. So in other words, it's a community that allows people from all walks of life, but also all different religious professions to come and pray and worship together. They included Rajput Muslims. Shah Hussein's family himself was from that background. They included artisans and people employed in different kinds of work and occupations in this urban context, like Telis. But we also know they tapped into rural networks. So Surat Singh's family, for example, represents that kind of connection. These were Kanbos. We know from Surat Singh's work that his family also visited Sikh shrines, and he spent a lot of time discussing some of these other communities that were present, that were also kind of networked into this. So in effect, what we are getting is a sense that many of these shrines draw on a very diverse base of devotees and patrons that span from low status groups in both urban and rural environments to middle status groups. None of them are particularly very elite, but quite a few of them, as we can see from just building the tomb and preserving manuscripts and acquiring literacy, definitely represent some of the social mobility we see in the Mughal world. Because of the efflorescence of trade, the growing amount of wealth that was creeping into artisanal communities, they can afford to own property, they can afford to educate their children. And in the rural context, we see a lot of the settlement that was being done of bringing new lands into cultivation also inevitably usually involved a bhagat or a peer, very similar to the networks that we are seeing here. So that's the background from which many of these shrines are emerging. If we get a sense of why the community was so interested in them, we of course need to go to the power of the words that many of these charismatic figures have. But let's look at it even more pragmatically. If you were looking at any of these shrines, and here I've tried to kind of crunch together all the different forms I ran into in both rural and urban areas in my research, whether it was a khanaka or a gurdwara complex or a maqbara or a samad, in other words, these funerary monuments where people were buried or had been cremated, very often they tended to hang on to the community that had gathered during the founder's life. If the founder had not given resources and directions for their own burial or afterlife, the community itself would build that commemorative building. And this was important because it actually had a role in the community. Because other than the caretaker of the shrine, who was very often either a family member or a close member of that community, you also had a wide variety of retainers who were being paid through endowments and donations made by the community. There was often an educational perspective. There were students living or visiting as day scholars on a regular basis. And usually that maktab or gurukul was actually teaching small numbers of students, but significant if you think about how many of these shrines existed in urban and rural areas. In addition to that, there's an economic dimension. Most of these shrines had a weekly haat that happened on the premises, and then one kind of very big annual Urs celebration. So what is happening here is a lot of buying and selling. In rural areas, for example, we know that some of these melas or Urs were often the site of selling either cattle or horses, which was a very, very huge cash-generating part of the economy at this stage. And in urban areas, there were particular artisanal groups that claimed particular shrines. So there's a kind of interesting economic purpose to the neighborhood shrine, as well as one that draws the community together back into the premises on a daily, weekly, and annual basis. And then finally, if these communities were, prosperous enough, particularly in rural areas where these shrines are sited in along the urban highways that feed into the big toll roads that existed in the Mughal time. You see many of them have guest houses, and we know that because if you look at the Waqf endowments that the British were doing away with in the 19th century as Punjab came under British rule, many of them had both a Muslim cook and a Brahmin cook to take care of the people who stayed there on the way. And again, this is not always for a religious purpose. They're basically doing this as an extension of their langar khana, where anybody who shows up is provided hospitality, of food, and a place to stay. So you can see there's a kind of very robust purpose and benefit to having one of these in your neighborhood or in your rural area. So let's get a sense of what this means for the period later on. So the people I have shared with you are from the early part of Mughal rule. We know this pattern actually persisted late into the 17th and 18th century. And if anything in the 18th century, it gets much more diverse. So we have examples here, and I'm going to talk about two. One is the individual called Baba Jalan, who's a very, very enigmatic character. His name pops up in many manuscripts, but he never fully affiliated himself with any one particular religious community. So what we can piece together from oral traditions and from written manuscripts is that he came from a rural family of Siddhu Jats who had been minor landowners, but in the Mughal period, when Jalan is born in the 17th century in a rural area outside of Amritsar, his family had moved into tax collection. So this is a very, very common pattern amongst rural families in this period. I wrote about it in my first book also. But Jalan does something different. Unlike other people who often founded and put under settlement new cultivations, in Punjab, the common pattern was to take members of your own caste biradri to do this. Jalan instead actually mobilizes a whole community of mixed caste groups, including Rajputs, Jats, as well as Dalits. And he heads into unsettled areas like around Nushehr Bhalla near Amritsar, but also in the province of Multan. And he sets up these new communities and eventually gets them into regular cultivation. In addition to that, we know he composed in Punjabi. We have 313 Sakhis and 42 Vishnupads that are credited for him. The oldest manuscript, as far as we can find, is in the Khalsa College collection. But there are also built remains. So we have this monument built over his samadhi. The one you're seeing on the right is being repaired. This is not the original building. One unfortunate effect of partition is Baba Jalan's community is displaced. The lands closer to Lahore and Multan were abandoned, and a lot of the community moved to the Republic of India post-partition. But they remain invested in it, and as you can see, there's a new generation now in this contemporary period that is recreating and repairing this particular building. All right, let's get a sense of what Baba Jalan's appeal might have been to the groups that he is talking to. One of the things you will notice, although there are strains common in Bhakti, it gives us a sense of why, like many other Bhagats and peers, he doesn't get absorbed into other organized religious communities. Although the Sikhs note that he was a contemporary of Guru Har Gobind Singh and often attended him, he also remains and retains a sense of independence, right? So let's get a taste here. Jalha sab jag chalna, tu dil sahi nalban, titwele kunch na sujsi, jat kal pakar si kan, jalha jatnu ram ne aisa dina isht, dharam koi jane nahi, karam karye karam brisht, right? So Jalha, let the whole world go its way. You focus on the heart of the beloved. Nothing will be gleaned from this path when death grabs you by the hair. Here we're getting a nice little colloquialism. The Lord will give Jalha Dajjal such a God. Nobody recognizes his faith, yet it erases all bad deeds. So already we're getting the sense that Jalha sees himself as a kind of nonconformist. And in fact, a lot of his verses address this. Nirgun Jalha ke guru hai, bepir Jalha ke pir, Ram naam jab kare pavitra, kare Ganga ke neer. So those without are teachers, are Jalha's teachers. So he's embracing this nonconformity. Those without a guide are Jalha's guide. Reciting God's name makes them pure. It is as if they stand next to the Ganges. Now, one of the kind of common things I have noticed in many of these poetries credited to Baba's Bhagats and Peers is that they place a lot of emphasis on Ram Naam, Naam Simran, and zikr, this idea of saying God's name aloud as a meditative practice. So that is definitely one kind of common theme. But the other interesting thing is, if you look at the manuscripts where the verses are preserved, very often they are in a kind of eclectic collection. So if you look at this manuscript number 1437, we see that Jalan has some kind of interesting company, but one we should expect given what we know about the circles and commemorative practices of the periods. In that same manuscript, we have Sagun poets like Surdas. There are definitely other Vaishnav poets there as well. We have some strikingly independent voices that seem to keep a very kind of parallel company with the verses of Jalan, like Bhagat Kabir and Raidas. But we also have some local ones that might be less familiar to our audience. So we find another contemporary of Jalan called Supriya Shah. And Supriya Shah is very much like Jalan in the sense that he does not wish to be affiliated with other groups, although he has a lot of amity and well-feeling towards these other groups that are represented in the contents of this poetry. He himself went on to find a separate panth called the Supriya Shahi Panth. And then finally, there is this figure of Bajid or Bajid. And it took me a while to figure out, because there's a very well-known Bhagat Bajid who is associated with the Dadu Panthi community. But in this case, for the Punjab context, we have a different person. And this is a particularly interesting one that takes us into the 18th century, which also helps us date the manuscript, which is slightly later than the period that Jalan was alive in. And this is a figure who is variously known as Bababhajid or Pirbajid. He comes from a Pathan family who he was active in the 18th century. We know for a while in his youth he was a professional soldier, but later in life he takes up contemplative poetry. He seems to have listened to a lot of Bhagat Bani, particularly Vaishnav poets, and he talks about the spiritual contemplation. We don't have a lot about him. Most of his verses now scattered in various manuscript collections, like the one you see here from the the Punjab Department of Languages. But if you look at his poems, again, that strand of non-conformity that we see in Jala is very, very present here. So here is verse 12 from a composition called Bajid Dishlok. And I'll read the Punjabi and you can see the English below you. Chori jade chor liyavan lut kar, खाए दे घी तू शक्कर चोरी कूट कर जा करन तेरी आस सो जादे भुकमर बाजिद कौन साहेब नु आखे ए ना ए कर. Right? So in other words, he's talking about the condition of the times. Thieves go robbing and bring back their loot. They feast on ghee and sugar from their thievery. Those that follow your command go to bed hungry. Bajid, who will tell the master, do this, don't do that? In other words, scold God for the state of the world. And this is a particularly kind of, I think, fun verse to land on, given the time period that we are looking at. A lot of Bajid's work is very contemplated. It's really looking at this idea that we also find in Bhakti and Sufi poetry of the world turned upside down. And in this ulat pulat of the world, Bajid is very contemplative. He notices that justice is very hard to achieve on the ground, but he keeps pointing it out as if by kind of directing our gaze towards it, he helps us to think through what our own actions, and he particularly talks about the pursuit of wealth, of privilege, of investment in hierarchies that are in fact feeding into this pattern and actually making the living conditions for ourselves and our community worse. So he represents this kind of later 18th century phase in this particular thing. And I will stop there. So why do I bring this up? Well, in a way, what I want to draw to your attention through my presentation is the importance of thinking about the ways in which these particular individuals are helping us see networks that are beginning to spring out in both urban and rural areas. They're being fueled, of course, by the very robust trade and social mobility we were seeing because of the rising Mughal economy. But we see they persist. Even as some of this economic mobility begins to break down in the 18th and 19th century, these networks remain very robust because they're drawing on these local things, on patrons who might be humble, but they have a greater staying power in part because of the larger numbers that they are evolving. And although some do get elite patronage, I think it's this kind of robustness of their local communities that help them survive. And if we look at the more later work that people like Anshuman Malhotra have done with the Gulab Dasiyas, or Yogesh Nehi is doing currently with contemporary Bhagat shrines in Punjab, we can get a sense of how much these networks survived and why this is not just a dead tradition I'm talking about. It is very much present and continues, and it's a living one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation. Professor Kaicker, you can proceed with yours.
Muted.
Okay, am I audible now? Yeah, great. So thank you, Supriya, Ishaan, Team Karwan, everyone for putting this together. This is really a wonderful opportunity. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join you. And I just wanted to sort of I wanted to offer some very scattered comments, drawing in part on what Professor Dhawan was saying, and try to relate them to some of the work that I've been doing recently, that I've sort of completed recently, that resulted in the publication of my book, called The King and the People, Sovereignty and Popular Politics in Mughal Delhi. So what I want to really talk about today is the question of money and commerce. Professor Dhawan has shown, in a sense, how Punjab already in the early 17th century, and as she sort of discussed today in particular, Punjab in the early 17th century is already beginning to display signs of a kind of rich commercial life. And so it's not really an accident that there are all of these spiritual guides and leaders, peers, and so forth, who are invested in the life of commerce, whether it is small-time commerce, humble work, or whether it is larger, more large-scale trade and so forth. And this is very important because it gets to a question that was very actively debated in Indian history about 20 years ago, or 20 or 30 years ago. And the question was really the question of the Mughal Empire as a commercial entity, and whether it was in fact a powerful commercial entity, whether there were people who were actively engaged in trade and commerce, whether it was sort of rich and vibrant, or whether it was largely a sort of agricultural society that was an extractive agricultural society. And so without necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of that particular debate, what I want to suggest here is that one way to sort of get at the question of commerce is to look at it through these forms of religious practice, and to see the sort of intertwining of religious practice and commerce, and the exchange and the movement of metaphors and ideas also between them, but also clearly the material basis for them, which is evident in the small shrines that dot the Punjab countryside. Now, my concern is with the city, has been recently, with the city of Delhi, which in a sense stands at the opposite end from the surrounding countryside, because it is really the largest Mughal city probably anywhere in the subcontinent in, let's say, the year 1700. And it's a major, I suggest it's a major sort of commercial hub and an important center in its own right. So if we have talked in a sense a little bit about the question of religion and commerce, which is a question that I'm also interested in, I hope to return to at a later point, what I really want to talk about today is the question of kingship and commerce. So what is exactly the relationship between trying to think about how Mughal kingship frames itself, and the question of money, and the question of gold, and the question of wealth, and the question of this idea that gets elaborated in Mughal discourse of fairs, the idea of abundance, of prosperity, where you can see in many places this idea that the king's job is in a sense to provide fairs. So I'm going to share my screen with you and see if I can actually show a couple of images. I'm afraid they're not going to show up as well as I would have liked, but I think that hopefully something will still be discernible of them. I suspect that's a very small image on your screen, but I'm afraid that's the best I can do right now. So you can sort of see here is a famous portrait of the Emperor Shah Jahan, and I'm afraid I can't actually zoom in, so you just sort of have to squint at your screen. But if you were to sort of squint at your screen, you would see that above the emperor's heads, you see these angels of a sort of distinctly European provenience who are sort of scattering gold and perhaps playing little musical instruments and so forth. And so what does this famous artistic image actually represent? So in my book, I sort of make the case more broadly that the Mughal court is a place where ideas of kingship, of power and how power should be exercised are being actively constructed through a variety of discussions and dialogues. And Professor Gandhi has also shown this in another sense for precisely the same period. For precisely the same period at the Mughal court. Now, my own contention in this regard would simply be that these figures, in a sense, stand for this idea broadly defined of what you could think of as this idea of daulat. And so daulat is a word that is common across the entire Islamic world. It's an important idea. And very frequently in the 17th century, you get the idea that kingly daulat is something that is, or the daulat of the king is something that actually animates his particular rule and movement. Okay, that's fantastic. So you can see this. You'll have to do this very nimbly for the next 3 images I'm also going to show you. So here you can sort of see this. You can see these images, and I suggest to you simply that there's an idea that draws on an older Indo-Persian sense, and the older Indo-Persian sense itself derives from a Turco-Mongol idea of heavenly illumination, of light, and profoundly of the sense that there is the dome above has a kind of authorizing force, and that authorizing force broadly can be sort of defined as daulat. And really you get the sense, particularly in Shah Jahan's court, where just the number of times the word daulat itself is used in all kinds of textual repertoires and referring to particular places really suggests that there is something concrete to this idea. Now, the idea of daulat as explicated under Shah Jahan doesn't go away. So here's another painting, which you can perhaps see over here. And this painting is a painting of the Emperor Bahadur Shah, the short-reigned Emperor Bahadur Shah. But what I kind of like about this painting, and again, I'm afraid it's going to be very hard to make out, is that you actually see both Khwaja Khizr presenting a kind of sword here. Khizr is obviously a very important figure in the Islamic tradition, but also there's a sort of like throne in the sky that's also visible. And so again, the idea that something comes from above that gives, that gives authorizing force to kingship is very much present across the Mughal court. So if that is the case, we're sort of left with a historical puzzle. And the historical puzzle is the following puzzle. If daulat represents some kind of sense of heavenly authorization, which I think is clearly present and obvious here, then why is it that in modern Urdu, the language that we speak in Delhi, the idea of daulat essentially means more or less nothing more than money, right? And I suspect, my claim, I think, is that in the early 18th and over the course of the 18th century, there's a kind of real transformation of the idea of daulat, where it becomes, so if you think of the semantic range, that is the range of meanings that daulat has, the idea of money is in a sense always present across the Indo-Islamic world. But in South Asia, over the course of the 18th century, it seems to me that daulat really truly seems to move its meaning from some sort of heavenly authorization to the idea that money itself is something that is going to be the force that animates the right to rule. And in part, this is probably related to the fact that the Mughal power of the early 18th century collapses really dramatically over the course of a set of political crises that I also discuss in my book. But in part, I think it's also because there really is a sense that the new contenders of the early 18th century, who come very much from the milieu that Professor Dhawan has shown us for the 17th century, so the people who are rising, new elites, who are claiming power precisely in places like Punjab, but also Awadh and elsewhere across the empire, Hyderabad and so forth. These people really derive their authority or their sense of power from tapping into the commercial vitality of the Mughal Empire, right? And from tapping into their command of financial resources. So precisely at the same time that imperial control is beginning to wane, you still have very much a highly commercialized society. And so this is one of my favorite images, it comes from the Rampur Raza Library. And here, this is really an image, I think, of Chandni Chowk, probably made in the 18th century. And what I love about this image is that, this is also an image of a king, like the last two images that we have seen. Except here, if you look at it, it's a little hard to find the king. And that's not just because the image is very small on your screen. It's also because, the way that the landscape of the city itself is set up, you can see that the Emperor Muhammad Shah, who's sort of to the center right, is actually dwarfed by the hustle and the bustle of Chandni Chowk and all of the activities that are going on, and all of the sale, the purchase, the entertainments, the people, the bheer bhaad bhadakka of the city, in a sense, has completely actually overwhelmed kingship. And so, in a sense, it's sort of interesting that Shah Jahanabad, the city of Delhi itself, was created by Shah Jahan to bring the virtues of abundance and fairs, and therefore money, in a sense, to his subjects. But by 70 or 80 years after that, we actually see that the commercial transformation of the empire has, in a sense, produced an environment where kingship itself falls, in a sense, in the snare of money. And I think that this is a really important transformation that continues to play out over the course of the 18th century, though it's beyond my abilities to identify it right now. But I'd like to close with an enigmatic verse that I found in a small manuscript at the Salar Jung Library in Hyderabad, which I think neatly encapsulates this particular transformation. And that verse, very simply, is this. It says, "Daulat talab az shikanja zar, birun naravad zibad shahi, uftad ba behere har se dunya, the dam e fulus hum chulmahi." And this is sort of like interesting and tricky word, because it seems to mean, literally it seems to say simply, somebody who seeks daulat is not going to leave golden fetters, right? Because of the fetters of gold, is not going to transcend kingship. He's always going to, because he is in the sea of the desire for the world. And so here again, the same religious imagery, because he's in the sea of the desire for the world, he's going to fall in the net, the fisherman's net, just like a little fish, just like a fish, right? Except, of course, I just want to point out that a lot of the words in this, poem itself, like shikanja zar, for instance, or fulus, or dam, and so forth, are themselves technical terms for minting money, right? So you can see again that there's a sense that commercialization itself, money itself, has become identified with the authorizing force of kingship. And I want to end this with a painting that I could not include in my book, but one that was discovered actually for everybody, by a student here, a fantastic student at UC Berkeley in art history called Shreya Kareti, who found this wonderful image. And we've been talking a little bit about what it was. And so what do you see in this image? Well, if you look at it, you see a woman. And you see a woman who's standing abstractly on a golden globe, and she is dropping gold from her hands. And she's dropping gold from her hands into a crowd of all kinds of people. So who are these people? Well, these people, I think, are simply the world. And I think that this person who is staring at us enigmatically is actually a representation of the goddess of Daulat, right? And so here it seems to me that the idea of the authorizing force, the thing that people chase in the world, the thing that people most want, no longer necessarily comes from the heavens above. It is, in fact, money in the abstract, which is the thing that is sought after by people, right? And so in a sense, this seems to neatly tap into precisely what we were talking about earlier, which is this idea that money, Daulat itself, in its financialized form, becomes absolutely the thing that animates political life more than ideas of heavenly kingship. And perhaps this is also why even in the late 18th century, when Mughal princes dream that they're going to become the king, they don't become the king, but when they dream that they're going to become the king, they have visions of a goddess. A woman will call to them, and that woman frequently will be Lakshmi. And Lakshmi, as you know, of course, is the goddess of wealth. And so this simply suggests that the movement of the idea of Daulat from heavenly approbation to a kind of financial power over the course of the 18th century is very much part of the story of the cultural life of commercialization in kingship in Mughal India. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Cherian.
Okay. Hi. And then are you going to put up my slides, Ishaan? Okay, so while Ishaan is doing that, so thank you, Ishaan, for organizing this, Supriya for getting the group together, and the rest of the panelists for being here, and the audience for listening. So my research, which is for a forthcoming book, which Ishaan mentioned in his introduction of me, is set in 18th century Marwar. So Ishaan, if you could go to the next slide. So, I mean, most of you, of course, would be familiar with the word Marwar, but the area outlined in red is where Marwar, the kingdom of the 18th century, and its contours as they were in the 18th century. This is what it looked like. I've also put up an image of the different parganas of Marwar with the capital at Jodhpur circled in red. So those who are students of history would, of course, be familiar that Marwar was among the Rajput kingdoms that accepted the suzerainty of the Mughal Empire and was integrated into the empire. But the Rajput kings were allowed to keep large parcels of this territory as their Watan Jagir. In the 18th century, with the collapse of the Mughal state, we have the Rathore kings of Marwar essentially becoming, in practice, full sovereigns of their territory. And that is the historical moment in which my research is set, and more particularly in the second half of the 18th century, by which point the Mughal state is even weaker. And the Marathas are active in terms of regular raids, etc., on this territory. So the next slide, please, Ishaan. So these are the records on which my research is based. These are as the title says, the Jodhpur Sanat Parwana Bahis, which are annualized compilations of the orders and decrees of the Rathore crown sent to Pargana officers. And these were all transcribed in these central documents. These sources begin in the 1760s and trail into, in fact, the 19th century. But I found that the nature of the documents changes tremendously in the early 19th century, when they really thin out. And so that is where my research stops. So as you can see, these are a huge fat bahis. What I was very struck by is how little reference there was in these bahis to figures like the Bhangi, who also went by a caste that also went by the name Halal Khor or Jhadukas in 18th century Marwar, and also in other parts of North India. So this to me was remarkable, because and why was it remarkable was that other castes that were also stigmatized and low ranked in the caste order, such as leather workers, that would be who are known as Chamars, Meghwals, Bhambis in Marwar, they come up in quite a large number. But the Bhangis, Bhangis Halal Khors are truly very few. They also, so those are truly very few. So what I did was to compile the few references that there were to the Bhangis, and I just want to discuss those with you. So one of these is when it's a particular episode which occurred in 1785, in which a Mahajan, which was a sort of a transcaste title given to merchants and money lenders, of a particular village in Parbatsar Pargana in Marwar, complained to the state that he had been punished for a crime that he didn't commit. So what had happened was that he was blamed for stealing grain by another merchant, and a village officer decided to punish him for this. And the punishment that was given to him was that he was tied up among Bhangis, and the Bhangis were ordered to spit on his face. And so he was so offended by this punishment, A, because of the nature of the punishment, and B, because he said he was innocent, that he went to the state in Jodhpur, the capital, to complain. And the state's decision in this case was that this was a punishment without judicial precedent. It was bedastur, and so it ordered that how could such a punishment have been ordered. Now, I know that actually this was not bedastur, because in a prior year, just 3 years before, in fact, in 1782, in a different pargana, somebody else had also been punished with being tied up in a public square and beaten with the shoes of Bhangis for 10 to 12 days. So the only difference was that in that case, the crown itself in Jodhpur had handed out this punishment rather than a provincial or a village level functionary. So that's this set of documents. And then there was a really remarkable one, which I believe it could be the next slide. Could you please change the slide? Yeah, this one, which I'll read out to you, the Marwari first, which is Apranch uche seher mein sara ino keh deno, supohar raat bajya, pache doe ghadi tai, Shri Parmeshwara now rojine liya kare, so Hinduvanu kejo, मैं तुरक ढेर चमार थोरी बावरी हलाल खोर अच्छेप जात हुए जीड़ा नु नहीं कहनो ने फिर चौंतरारा आदमी रोजी ने शहर में फिर ने कया करे सुपोहर रात बाज्या पछे दोए घड़ी ताई सदा ही नाव लेवो करे श्री हजूरो हुकम छे. Now, I don't know if any of you read the English while I was saying this, but in sum, what this document is saying is that about a quarter of an hour past sunset every evening, everyone in the towns of Merta and Nagaur should be told to recite the name of Shri Parameshwar, but that this should be relayed only to the Hindus, which is written as Hinduva, but not to the Achhe, which means literally untouchable, as in one who cannot be touched. These being Turaks, that's Muslims, Chamars, Dheds, two leatherworking castes, Thoris, Bavris, which are landless vagrant castes, and Halal Khors, which are the Bhangis that I mentioned earlier. And this is by the order of Shri Hajur, that is the crown. Men from the local administration should roam around the towns daily announcing this instruction. So this to me was, and I will say it is a remarkable document because I didn't find many others that clearly laid out like this. This is the meaning of Achhep. So we certainly find the Bhangi here, but we also find a range of other castes, which tells us that, this document tells us a lot of things, but one of those is that there was such a category called untouchable, literally translated as such in pre-colonial South Asia, and that this category existed also in law. It was activated and implemented through law, and not just in Brahminical discourse or bhakti poetry and things like that. The other thing that it tells us is that the meaning of this category was not clear, which is why the state had to say, but don't tell it to the Achhep, these people are the Achhep. Which then takes me to where my inquiry then went, which is that I found a range of other references that use the word Achhep, or literally untouchable, with reference to caste. One of these, and to me what was noteworthy in these is that the contours of Achhep were shifting. So sometimes there would be these remarkable ones in which we have, for example, the Mahajans of Pali, who got together in 1785. So it's actually around the same time that the guy was spat on by the Bhangis, but in a different province. So the Mahajans of Pali town got together and put an appeal to the state saying that the Brahmins, Mahajans, and other high castes, which they literally use the term Uttam Jat, have been drawing water from the same part of a particular of the town's tanks and wells as the rest, which are all Achhep castes, all untouchable castes. So here it's the Brahmins, Mahajans, and some undefined high caste versus the rest. When the order of the crown is quite interesting, which is that Agansu, Brahman, Mahajan, Vagere, Uttam Jat to eke ghat bharya kare, ne Achhep Jat duje ghat pani bharya kare. So the Brahmins, Mahajans, and other elite castes should draw water from one side, one ghat, and all the other Achhep Jats should draw water from another side. So here we have this sort of polarizing description. Separately, I had another one in which there is an order from the state vis-a-vis prisons, where in the Jalor town, the local kotwal objected to the fact that the governor had begun to house what he called untouchable castes with high castes, where again he listed Rajputs, Mahajans as the examples of high castes, and the exact sentence was Rajput, Mahajan vagere nu Achhep bhela kin tare rakhni ave. How can you house Rajputs, Mahajans, etc. with untouchables? So here again we have a very, very high caste versus everyone else. The next kind of gradation in this was to exclude artisanal castes and below. So this would be, for example, I have a reference in which some girls were found who were clearly being trafficked for sale. So they were without any kin, their origins were unclear. So this band of girls happened to get intercepted by some functionaries of the state, and the response of the crown in Jodhpur was to say that all the girls from this group who were not of such castes as carpenter, blacksmith, goldsmith, barber, and Muslim, or of any other untouchable or achep caste were then to be sent to Jodhpur. So here we have a kind of a loose definition again of achep, which includes artisanal castes and Muslims, like again one of the earlier references I had mentioned. And it's, of course, the one interesting thing here is that quite often as historians have shown, slavery was a type of social death, and part of that social death was the erasure of the prior caste identity of the slave in question. So here it's interesting that there remains an investment in what was the caste origin of a female slave before she is integrated into a domestic establishment. So that's again where artisanals were excluded is one set of categories, and then the next gradation in the way achep was sometimes defined was when it excluded specifically leather workers. So with that, for example, I have a reference in which I'm trying to find it because it's all mixed up. But in which a leather worker, a bhambi, was for some reason making ghee, and he came to sell this ghee to the state. And while selling the ghee, there was an ijaradar who had taken the contract of weighing the ghee and assessing the state's tax on it. But this ijaradar's employee took the ghee in the bhambi's own plate and stored it away for future sale. This became a point of contention where the state said, how could you take ghee in an achep caste's bartan, vasan was the word, when other people might then unknowingly buy it. So in this case, there's a specific, calling out of leather workers here, bhambi, as being objectionable. And finally, another similar sort of cordoned off idea of the untouchable is a sort of landless vagrant castes like the Thoris, who generally lived out in the scrub, but also worked in villages in Marwar as landless laborers, as well as employees for Jagirdars in a sort of military capacity. So there is an example in which a Mahajan approaches the state for help because his son-in-law, also a Mahajan, kicked the petitioner's daughter in the belly when she was pregnant, causing her pregnancy to terminate. And then as she was lying on her funeral pyre, he asked a Thori Swami, a renunciant, to cut open her belly. I'm not sure why he did this. Maybe he thought there could be another child in there. It's quite clearly said that the fetus came out before she died. So she lay on her pyre, he has her womb slit. So the father's concern was of course, the fact that the daughter was killed, but he was also concerned, and the state in its reply says, why did you have to have the womb slit by an untouchable caste? And specifically, if I'm able to locate this, it says, achep jaat karne pet kyon fadavno pade? And so for this, the person who did this was punished with a fine. So that's sort of the span in terms of caste, how this plays out, and the one thing I want to flag here is that this status of achep, or being an untouchable, was not restricted in the 18th century state's imagination to those who we would today call Hindu. That is, as you've already noticed, we had the Turak come up as a person who was also untouchable. For example, in this being a very remarkable record in which that happens, the one that's on screen, but there was also another reference in which we have the state say that, and this is a longer story, but that Muslims and other low castes or Musalman vagere neech jaat should not be allowed to keep herds of goats or sheep. So here again, there's a clubbing of a Musalman with neat jaat, as there was with the slave girl question, where again, Musalmans were listed as examples of explicitly untouchable castes. So, tying together all of these references, well, what do we take away from this? So the first is that I think there is more to say about the history of untouchability in pre-colonial South Asia than has already been said. There has been very important work done on, Dharmashastrik law, Brahmanical law. There has been important work also done from the Bhakti perspective in terms of the, poetry composed in the voice of the untouchable. But it is, Well, so those kinds of references can often be indicative or give us a sense of the discourse of untouchability or the literary or the legal imagination of untouchability. But the argument can be made that we do not know how and to what extent it was actually practiced. The one area from which we do have some insight about that is the Peshwa state in modern day Maharashtra, where again scholars have shown the implementation of a polarized caste order of untouchability, though I'm not sure if it is using a name like Achep, which literally translates to untouchable. But there, in that case, it has been possible to explain that by saying, well, this is a Brahmin-led state, so it is trying to implement a Brahminical idea of society. So I think these materials from Marwar point to something else that is going on outside of the Maratha kingdom that I suggest is part of perhaps a turn in certain post-Mughal polities that are ruled by what we would today call Hindu kings. And this is also reflected in other outputs by those courts, which often use terms like Hindu in opposition to Musalman or Turak, often in pretty strident terms. But that could still be explained, using the kind of explanations that Cynthia Talbot has convincingly shown, which is that at times of stress, at times of political conflict, we often have a heightening of this oppositional discourse. And also that discourse is very Hindu versus Turak or Hindu versus Musalman. But I think paying attention to the types of sources that I have, which are not about courtly production, but are about the administration of society, it suggests that the category Hindu, which again the source studies up, it explicitly uses the term Hindu and tries to define what is Hindu, was fleshed out, understood, administered, imagined in terms of caste, so that it is possible to place the Muslim as an untouchable, and it is also possible to imagine the Hindu as a group of elite castes. So and in that sense, the suggestion that I'm also trying to make is that in the pre-colonial past, Hindu, first of all, clearly existed as a term, but that it was not what perhaps a simple reading or a imposition of modern categories. It was not simply a sort of a religious category, but much more so it was a caste category, and that processes in the 18th century intensified the redefinition of Hindu in these caste terms, leading to a greater polarization and a stigmatization of low castes as well as Muslims. And in this is where the Bhangi comes back in. The Bhangi became the very embodiment of that which was most feared, that is the status of the untouchable and the bodily being of an untouchable. And it is the Bhangi who was at the very, so in these shifting contours of what it meant to be untouchable, the figure that was most undebatably not whose status was not debatable was the Bhangi. And the daily marginalization as well as this sort of weaponization of the Bhangi's body only underscored for everyone else what it meant to be and symbolized what it meant to be untouchable. So that's roughly my argument vis-a-vis caste, and this fits into my larger argument in which I show that these types of polarizations, segregations played out on a range of sites, which included residential space, it included temple communities, and this is where I think it connects or maybe speaks to some of the stuff that Purnima was saying. Played out in particularly Vaishnav Bhakti communities centered on the worship of Krishna, like the Vallabh Sampradaya. It played out also in terms of new ethical approaches that were implemented through law, such as the drive to protect animal lives, which is a fascinating chapter in the history of 18th century Marwar, where animal slaughter was banned, and that ban was actually implemented, as well as a drive to impose chastity on the aspirant elites, which brings me to some of the points that Abhishek raised, and I think Purnam also talked about, which is the role of mercantile castes, Mahajans, who, as you can see, were quite an active presence in the records that I just mentioned, where I suggest that the 18th century, and this is where the historical context, apart from the post-Mughal issue, becomes important, that the 18th century sees merchants capitalize on longer-term processes that have played out in the centuries prior, where they dominate the state in Rajasthan, and which is why I think it's important to also say, what are we talking about when we're talking about the state? Well, here it's merchants, moneylenders, and that they are also becoming dominant in the economy. As we know, when we hear Marwar, we think of the Marwadis, and that process is actually unfolding parallelly in the 18th century, that Marwadis have fanned out and are dominating money flows across the subcontinent, and that is having an effect also on the social order in Marwar. So I suggest that many of these polarizations are being driven by Marwadis. So I had a few other slides, but I don't have to show them. And so that is the sort of the larger picture into which the particular materials I shared with you today fits. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. The presentation.
It's okay.
Okay, so I imagine it is my turn next. Okay, while the presentation is loading. So of course, thank you so much to Ishaan and my fellow panelists. I'm so thrilled that you agreed to join, and I've really, really been enjoying your presentations. Just a word about the broader context of what I'm going to present today. It's a tiny little sliver from a book that I'm writing that explores the role of Persian and Urdu writings in the emergence of modern Hinduism. And one of the things that I look at is to see the change in a discourse of Persianate universalism before colonialism after the consolidation and crystallization of Hinduism as a religion in the colonial period. So how does Persianate universalism become a Hindu universalism? And what does that tell us about our later ideas of both secularism and Hindu nationalism? So that's a very, very broad project. And what I'm going to give you is just a tiny little snapshot from a little part of it. But before I just jump into that, I wanted to say a couple of words, because as I was listening to all three of your previous presentations, I was actually reminded of a chapter that comes prior to this, where I look at the rise in sectarian formations, especially the various bhakti sampradayas, concomitant with the rise of mercantile castes. So there's a connection between both of these in a similar period, and the cultivation of a certain kind of ascetic self-fashioning that one sees expressed in both Hinduvi and Persian writings. So that's another part of my work that sort of speaks perhaps a little more directly to what the three of you were talking about. So as to what I'm going to speak about today, this is about the role of Persian in the production of colonial knowledge. Now, it's commonly known, of course, that Persian was the language of the Mughal court and the Mughal administration, and perhaps less commonly known, unless you are sort of a student of history and have read some of the scholarship on this, that Persian was also the first language that British East India Company officials learned and wanted to produce knowledge about the regions over which they ruled, and produce knowledge that would help in the efficient functioning of their administration. So this issue speaks to the question of rupture and continuity in the colonial transition, of course, a much debated issue. And I'm going to give you an example of a particular figure. Now, the picture that you have here in the presentation is from a 19th century colonial manuscript on castes, categorizing castes called Tashriyul Aqwam by James Skinner. And here you have a picture of a Khatri boy, maybe learning Persian with his father. The Khatris were castes that typically sort of had this hereditary pattern of learning Persian. But I'm going to speak to you about the case study of another figure. Next slide, please, Ishaan. This figure is a Brahmin. He's also belongs to a Vaishnava order, Pandit Anand Khan, who also had the Persian pen name or takhallus of Khush. And he lived in Shahjahanabad in the late 18th century. And so this is the story of his life and works in brief that I have pieced together from his various manuscripts in which he gives little snippets of his life. So he leaves Shahjahanabad in search of grain and water, that is, to earn his living. And by this time, the population of Shahjahanabad has dropped. There have been repeated invasions, political instability, and centers, cities in the east are booming. So he goes eastwards, which was quite common. He goes to the city of Benares, which had at about 200,000 people, almost double the population of Delhi. And he stays there for about a decade until he meets Jonathan Duncan, the resident of Benares. And after that, his fortunes change, and we can trace his scholarly intellectual trajectory for a few years. One of his first works was a divan of poetry, in which he demonstrates his mastery of a number of Persian poetic genres. Next slide, please. So the Benares in which Anand Khan landed was very much a city in change and transition. There were a number of Maratha elites, and they were engaged in not only making the city a popular pilgrimage spot. Again, this is something that we see as a pattern in North India. Ayodhya, Vrindavan, and Benares really take off as major pilgrimage spots in the 18th century. We see the Marathas also patronizing the building of a number of temples. Including the famed Vishwanath temple that happened while Anand Khan was present there. So we see not only Maratha elites, we see the consolidation of British East India Company power in Benares at the same time. Next slide, please. Now, so these names are perhaps too small for you to read, but this is just a list of the Hindu poets and out of a list of many, many poets in a tazkira of the early 19th century. And this is a tazkira, it's a collection of poets and poetic biographies by a certain Zulfiqar Ali Mast, who was engaged in the service of the East India Company. So we know, of course, about Benares as a center of Hindu learning and Sanskrit, but during this period, Benares becomes a hub of Persian and Urdu or Rekhta literature. And in fact, it's the East India Company that attracts all these people who are seeking governments, who are seeking to serve in it and get employment, and who are showing off their prowess in Persian. And this includes many, many Hindus. So when Anand Khan Khosh arrived in Benares, he was not alone. His name is not mentioned in this particular tazkira, but it just goes to show how many indeed poets and writers of Persian there were who cultivated their art in the hope of government employment and took part in the literary and intellectual discourses of the day in Benares. Sometimes they would stop in Benares to head eastwards or to travel around. Next slide, please. Now, Benares was also considered by East India Company officials to be the seat of a kind of immutable Hindu or Sanskrit learning. And there were many ways in which the East India Company sought to harness that learning and also take control over its production. So Jonathan Duncan, who was the resident of Benares at that time, founded the Benares Sanskrit College in 1791. The picture that you have is a slightly later building. It's not the original building. So in doing so, Jonathan Duncan showed himself to be a patron of learning, much like other Indian rulers of the region, whether Mughal or whether rulers of Awadh and so on. But also, he provided a means for the company to again harness this learning and this knowledge production to their own interests and to cultivate a class of authorized native informants, of whom Anand Khan was one. So Anand Khan Pandit was the professor of Puranas at the Sanskrit College. He got a handsome salary of 100 rupees per month, and he also was employed to assist Duncan in the translation of various Sanskrit texts. Next slide, please. So this is a list of some of the works of Anand Khan that I have managed to reconstruct. So as you see, from late 1791 to late 1794, he was engaged in the prolific translation of many texts. Many of them were multi-volume works, and in all of them he acknowledges the direction and guidance of Jonathan Duncan. And the question that I'd like to address here is, how does Anand Khan's work, how does his intellectual output here change in significance with a new context? Now, in many ways, what this Pandit was doing was not all that dissimilar from what other Hindus working in the Mughal administration were also engaged in. There were many Hindus who were literate in Persian. So after the famous Mughal court-sponsored translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian, these Hindus took on the task of producing their own translations of sacred texts for their own purposes. Or sometimes they were commissioned by other rulers or aristocratic patrons to produce these texts. So in a sense, what Jonathan Duncan was having Anand Khan do was not all that new, but it was a very different context. This was a time also when though initially the East India Company had latched on to Persian again as the good language of administration, there were doubts that were emerging just about the value of these Persian translations. So William Jones, who might have been initially enamored of them, after he got someone to, he convinced someone to tutor him in Sanskrit, started actually seeing them as inauthentic, that that it was better to go to the actual pristine Sanskrit source, and that somehow the Persian translation sort of muddied the waters. So already you do see new epistemologies and new approaches towards knowledge. So among these works, there was the Adhyatma Ramayana. Again, there had been a tradition of Persian Ramayana works. And then you see a number of Puranas, the Gaya Mahatmya, the Matsya Purana, the Kashi Khanda of the Skanda Purana translation. These were Puranas that were, again, associated with the burgeoning pilgrimage areas of North India at that time. And especially the Skanda Purana was very, very much invoked during the late 18th century, and one that was invoked by Marathas who were turning Benares into the center for pilgrimage. And then we also have the Mitakshara, a work on Hindu jurisprudence or law, which also proved to be of very practical use to the British administration. And the final work is the Masnavi Ekajkala, which is literally kind of the Masnavi, or the kind of the narrative poem of the crooked-capped one, the one with his cap askew. Now the image of the youth with a slightly kind of jauntily placed cap is often used as a metaphor for the divine beloved. And in this case, next slide, please. Okay, actually, Ishaan, could you go to the next one and then come back to this one? Thank you so much. Yes. So this is the frontispiece to this Masnavi Ekajkala, and we see here a figure who looks very much like the earlier colonial portrait of Anand Khan. He's wearing his kind of Vaishnava headgear. He's sitting at the feet of Krishna and writing. So there is this indirect play here between this very Persianate image of the Kajkula and Krishna over here, the sort of divine Krishna. But the Masnavi itself uses a whole range of examples, mainly taken from Islamicate kings, whether from really all over the Islamic world, who are in dialogue with ascetics. So he gives a range of their stories and then kind of brings out the moral underpinnings and implications of these. So if you could go to the previous slide, please. So what do we make of the broader context of colonial interest in Indian antiquity, in which Anand Khan and his own translation works was contributing? and of course, this is not an exhaustive image, but these are just some other clues from the time period. So one other contemporary of Anand Khan in Benares was Major Francis Wilford, who also later became the secretary of the Sanskrit College. And he was very interested in studying the Puranas, the Sanskrit Puranas, to find out the exact geography of ancient India and to also find references in the Puranas to the sources of Western civilization. And so, for instance, he would find references to classical sort of Greek and Roman concepts and Egypt in the Puranas. And then he even published this particular article on Egypt and other countries, etc., adjacent to the Nile of Ethiopia, in Asiatic Researches, which was the premier kind of Orientalist journal of the time, started by William Jones. And later on, he discovered that his Pandit was actually cheating him, inventing verses and making up all of these kind of fake etymologies. But still, Wilford kind of was still hung on to this idea of tapping this kind of ancient primordial wisdom that was common to both classical civilization as well as to ancient India. So Anand Gan was again contributing towards making this knowledge accessible. And then in the Desiderata of Asiatic Researches, where in a later issue of the journal, where it was mentioned that there were just certain items that that needed to be carried out. So one of them, you can see that it's clearly in the service of imperial rule, a catalog of the names, towns, countries, etc. So of course, naming, mapping, etc. These are all strategies that are important to the realizing of imperial ambitions. And in this case, there's also an attempt to historicize. There's an attempt to bring back the names from the Shastras and the Puranas alongside the modern names. And then also, secondly, to explore what are the geographical and political divisions of the country before the Musalman invasion. So you can see already a periodization of Indian history. Now, again, Orientalism was not a uniform discourse. There were those who valorized the sort of Hindu Sanskritic civilization. There were those who felt that that was kind of corrupt, and like James Mill, and maybe the Muslim invasions brought about some like mild change. But at the same time, we do see the periodization based on religion. So we see, again, Anand Khan carrying out some rather familiar kind of literary projects that gain a new meaning and significance in the colonial context. Next slide, please. The one after that. Thank you. To end with, I just want to give you a couple of examples. To save time, I'm just going to read to you the English from the Masnavi Akaj. So these are not Anand Khan's kind of specific stories. The first just comes from the introduction, and then the second one comes from a very overtly, explicitly autobiographical segment. The first one, he has, again, this very ecumenical sentiment that he expresses. The Veda in Hindi and in Arabic, the Quran, came to be like the Torah revealed to Moses. The books of the Bible were bestowed upon Jesus. In the language of each one did God give his command. We can see echoes in this of a previous Mughal project of making equivalences between various sacred texts. For instance, Dara Shukoh's project of translating the Upanishads and saying this is actually revealing the hidden book of the Quran. So we can see, there's already a prior process of equivalence making, but this is also a new context of the idea that there is an ancient scripture or an ancient constitution that is possessed by individual peoples or nations. So we can see that also expressed here, where the Hindus have their Veda, the Muslims have their Quran, etc. So we see different law books, the command, that are assigned to different peoples. The second verse, he uses again very common Persianate metaphors to talk about divine unity. I am an idol worshipper, Buddh Parast. My form is that of the Zunar wearers. So form, again, which is kind of untranslatable, but which the British often translated as either race or caste. The Zunar is a sacred thread that was associated with Zoroastrians, and again in the Indian context associated with Brahmins. So he's saying that I'm an idol worshipper. I belong to the infidels, to those who wear the Zunar, but I'm intoxicated with the wine of passion for divine truth. Again, he presenting himself in using these tropes that are very common to Persian poetry. But in the 1790s, this is also a time where we see similar monotheistic ideas expressed and developed in more detail by many of Anand Khan's contemporaries in Benares. This is also very close to the time that Raja Ram Mohan Roy was said to have visited Benares. And indeed, something that I can reserve for another time. This speaks to a language of Hindu monotheism that is being newly developed amongst Hindus literate in Persian, and a language of primordial monotheism that we find some Muslim writers also drawing upon. So these are just some examples of the kinds of Persian knowledge that are being produced during this period. And as we don't have much time left, I'm going to end now. And I think we'll have a few minutes of discussion amongst ourselves before we open it up to audience questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation. So before you start the discussion, I would like to say that Karwan was very fortunate to have you all together on this panel. So you can start with the discussion, I guess. We have around 10 minutes for the discussion left. Then we can take some questions from the audience.
I can ask. I have a question for Purnima. I was struck by the artisanal backgrounds of some of these. The figures around whom these communities were centered. So were there also, because I saw up to like blacksmith, but what did it go lower down to leather workers? And also, was that somehow was the caste background significant in any way, or was it just matter of fact?
I think it's actually a little bit of both, and it depends who's writing the source. So for a lot of the people who are writing the Persian sources, they almost always use the caste name after introducing the person, right? And I think it's partly because most of those authors, like Surat Singh, for example, are coming from a much more literate and elite background, and they're much more conscious of it. When it shows up in scraps of poetic studies, which is where you get the non-elite representation of these people's lives as they are remembered and recounted, it's less common to see the caste name being used. Oh, and again, but it's harder to tell. Is it because it's not fitting into that poetic meter, or whether they don't actually think of these individuals through these caste tropes? But I would say that the way these institutions are set up, and this continues, by the way, some of these groups spread into the Deccan and into the Gangetic Plain as well. A very important part of that is the Langar Khana and the Satsang, which is when they worship together, seated in the same space on the ground, but also eat and, communalize together. So in a way, I think the institutions are actually set up to, accommodate difference, but also force people into the kinds of socialization that they would not normally have had. And I think this works a little bit different from other shrines that you do see in rural and urban Punjab, in which particular sampradaya identities and caste identities are kept separate, right? So I think there is something different about these bhagats and peers.
Oh, fascinating.
I was also, just to follow up on that, I was curious from both Divya and Purnima. Just if now Divya, you do mention that the idea of achieve or untouchable is a shifting category that is being constructed and expands and so on. And I'm just wondering if you just go back a little earlier in an earlier period, do you see a kind of, whether it's a reification or consolidation of ideas of caste in Mughal records, for instance, or in other works? Or is this something that it just becomes more visible in the 18th century?
Is that for both of us?
Sure.
I'll let Divya go.
So, the tricky thing about these sources are that they are unique. So, of course, there are sources for before the 18th century from Marwar, but those are often like an administrative survey or some court chronicle or some literary source. So they cannot have the same kind of ground level documentation. So I cannot, really say that this category was not at all used or operationalized before, but I would be surprised. I don't think it was invented. But what I was struck by is that a lot of the petitions in which these things come up demand a change from prior patterns in which there is cheek by jowl living, or there is, a mixed kind of thing. And you have in fact an effort to create newer segregations. So I can't say for sure that the category was new, but it does seem like the effort to create the distance, a social distancing before COVID, it did, that seems to me to be new. And I think this is, there are not from Marwar, which I study, but from Jaipur, there is indication of, Jai Singh II taking a lot of interest in forcing even religious communities, communities to have these types of segregations, saying you will not ordain members of the law, or a low caste person cannot ordain, making them do a pledge that in writing. So there seems to be something afoot that's what I think is this sort of larger post-Mughal Hindu kingship context, which I think is new. But he doesn't use at least I haven't seen the word achieve in those types of records. I don't work on Jaipur, I've only come across these.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, really briefly, I do think there's a malleability to it, but the state is often responding to requests made by petitioners in these cases. You see it in the Mughal context in other provinces also. But one thing we need to keep in mind is, not all of Mughal India is settled. In Punjab, as much as a third of the population might have been pastoral nomads. And you have a lot of merchant groups that are traveling constantly. And I think that kind of mobility also messes with the different categories they might have been plugged into, but they are constantly eluding the ability of people to frame them in a particular way. I think less the 18th century, I think it's the 19th century, where, there's a certain rigidity to movement also that actually allows a kind of cataloging. And of course, the colonial state is very interested in cataloging that I think helps to freeze those categories a bit more. I actually have a question for Abhishek. I was wondering if you could talk about the circularity of Daulat, right? This idea that it's almost of a liquid quality. And there are networks through which it is supposed to flow. And do you see that changing or not in the period you look at?
The networks through which it flows over the course of the 18th century. Yeah. It's hard to say. I don't really, it's in a sense, you're going to reconstruct some of the networks through which I suppose we will trace this flowing. But one index for me always is something that Catherine Asher had pointed out a long time ago, which was this idea, for instance, of the bungalow walls. The bungalow charokas that were constructed by Jahangir and Shah Jahan, in particular, to frame the royal figure as he appeared in courts, which over the course of the 18th century become absolutely ubiquitous all over the subcontinent, right? And so if you go to, I can think of like hundreds of buildings that you see, whether they're local zamindar houses or the houses of local nobility, whether they're gurudwaras, whether they're all kinds of really other buildings where you will see the incorporation of this distinctive arch roof, right? And so that to me suggests that if the point of the bungalow arch was to actually show the emperor in a very particular light, in light of the kind of like daulat that he receives from up there, then you can sort of see the liquidity and the malleability of this idea. So daulat flowing not as gold directly, but the idea of daulat sort of percolating through society. And you can sort of see it percolating very widely indeed and across a range of registers, which is, of course, exactly what you would expect, given the sort of largeness of the semantic transformation of the idea.
So thank you so much, speakers. There's a question for Divya ma'am from Akansha Kumar. The question is, do you come across any specific definitions of who exactly were categorized as untouchables in the 18th century Marwar? Since many castes were in Rajasthan were nomadic, didn't really have a fixed profession, like Bazigar, Banjaras, later categorized as criminal tribes under colonial rule, who were included in the category of untouchables later.
Yeah, so the record that one of the records I shared, the one I put up in a slide, that actually defines in that particular order who is untouchable. And so I think while Bazigars, Banjaras, I've only come across one or two references to Banjaras, and they seem to be a presence that goes through. They are not petitioners to the state, whatever. It's actually a boy who runs away or something with them. So I don't have any reference to any Bazigars, but to take and by the way, hi Akanksha, the JNU acquaintance. But the spirit of your question, I think, is what about these so-called what become criminal tribes, and that I think is a fascinating question because first of all, of course, there is no such conception of tribe as being something different. The groups that in this region that become classed as criminal tribes are the Minas, the Mairs, the Bavris. The Bavris are actually listed among the untouchable castes in that, and the way they are treated in other records also is in a very stigmatizing kind of way, coding them as not being part of this sort of Hindu domain. Same for Thoris, which are a same vagrant, landless kind of caste. Mairs, Minas, etc., seem to just be a thing of their own. That's what's quite fascinating. They are not like the Thoris and Bavris because they actually command armed power. And they also control villages, not so much in Marwar, but I think like the Mairs closer to Delhi, they did, and the Mavs, which are today's Mayos. Those groups are not understood as untouchable at this time. There is actually a difference. So that would be my answer for this question of groups that later became criminal tribes. But just to go back though, the Bavri, Thori, the way they are understood, the so-called untouchable ones, it's in a very criminal kind of way. There is something there where it's not just that they are polluted or doing dirty work, but that they are also given their suspicious and they cause trouble to the state.
So we'll take one last question because we are running out of time. This question is for everyone in the panel. There are other parts of the nation as well, apart from the northern part of the country, like the Deccan or the Marathas. So, what about them? Can you all talk about those? How they failed to establish a pan-Indian empire?
Let me actually respond to that, but outside of the imperial context. I think if you look in areas that are the Deccan, what you do see is a parallel case of shrines, for example, getting a lot of support from either local merchant networks or small land owning groups. But I think the context there is very different because there are different status groups involved in that. There's some really fascinating work going on with Tamil and Kannada Bhakti, for example, that is looking at those copper plate grants and also trying to understand how they fit into the polity. But I do think that it shows a very different kind of social network and power sharing that you see in the North. And that is something that deserves its own kind of, close regional reading, in part because it's really hard to make these pan-regional arguments without being attentive to how different the power structures are. I mean, even if you look in the North, what Divya is describing and what I am describing look quite different, even though these are adjacent areas with long historical connections.
Yeah, anyone else who wish to speak on this?
It was just to clarify, the question was that why is it the Marathas failed to establish an empire?
Yeah, why other states, including the Marathas or the Deccan?
I mean, this is one of those counterfactual types of questions. There can be a lot of explanations, a lot of theories. But one sort of macro look would be to also think about the changing nature of the global capitalist economy, the role of companies, European companies, the change in power relations in the Indian Ocean. And the fact is that by 1750s, the British had become a territorial power. So there might be, or that might be an element of this story, so that if we think of, the British still as very peripheral, but we don't realize the sort of larger structural economic changes, fiscal changes, transformations that might be playing a role, that is something to keep in mind. So we can't compare, for example, the point in the 1500s when the Mughals are making their empire versus the point in 1750 when, say, the Marathas would have carved out an empire of a similar scale. So that's one possible perspective. I think Purnima's point was really important too. I'm sure there are many other things we could say.
Yeah, so I think I'd just like to step in and just add something to what Professor Cherian said, which is, I think, and really, the colonialism is obviously a central and really important feature here. But the other thing I just want to sort of point out is that so much of the scholarship over the last 25 or 30 years has really sort of shown us how tremendously vital and energetic the entire subcontinent is. So, every single part of the subcontinent that you sort of look at, broadly defined, and I don't want to reduce the subcontinent to the outlines of the Republic of India, but really from the region encompassing Afghanistan into Burma. These are places where you have enormous intellectual production, enormous cultural production, all kinds of religious transformations are taking place. You have all kinds of new forms of power and the localization of power taking place under the carapace of the Mughal Empire. There's a great deal of violence, there's a great deal of military activity, there's a great deal of conquest, but there's also a great deal of sort of like popularization of things that were previously elite in the century before. So really, I mean, the 18th century overall is a time of just extreme vitality. And the end of the 18th century, in a sense, doesn't necessarily look like what you would expect it to look from the beginning of the 18th century. So I guess what I'm saying is, the Mughal Empire ends and it opens a sort of space for all kinds of things. But to end with the British marching into Delhi in 1803 is a very different